Hello, everybody, and welcome to E-Train Talks. I'm your host, Ethan, a 14-year-old literacy advocate and the proud founder of E-Train Talks, Inc., a 501c3 charitable nonprofit dedicated to spreading the joy of reading. And today's interview is one I've been eagerly anticipating. As someone who began my reading journey with nonfiction and nonfiction only, I am very excited about today's guest. Joining me is the incredibly talented children's book author, Nicholas Day. He's an award-winning writer who brings history to life through thought-provoking, entertaining, and fact-filled reads. From picture books to gripping middle-grade novels, Nicholas crafts compelling narratives that spark curiosity and feed young minds with fascinating trivia and historical intrigue. I am so thrilled to have you all here today at E-Train Talks, and I'm so thrilled that you have the opportunity to learn about Nicholas's journey and his books. So without further ado, welcome to E-Train Talks. It's truly an honor to have you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And I read Mona Lisa Vanishes maybe a year or two ago, and I've been hoping to talk with you ever since I read it. So it's an honor to have you as a guest on my show. I prepared a few questions. Well, by a few, I mean 10 or so. So if you're ready, let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
So to kick off our talk, let's start with your award-winning The Mona Lisa Vanishes, which I have right here. The Mona Lisa Vanishes is a legendary painter, a shocking heist, and the birth of a global celebrity. I've always been a lover of history, as I mentioned earlier, and a good mystery as well. So, you combine both in this fascinating and award-winning book. One very intriguing message that you share is that the Mona Lisa painting may never have become as famous as it did had it not gone missing from the Louvre and received so much attention. That's an interesting and curious theory, and many people, including myself, have never given the chance to think about until your book. We hadn't crossed our minds. So, that being said, what sparked your desire to research and write a book detailing the story behind the Mona Lisa and its disappearance? And what do you hope your readers take away from your book?
Right. So the Mona Lisa Vanishes was my inaugural effort to try to write nonfiction for younger readers.
Mhm.
And I was looking for a story that had a really sort of exciting core to it, like a dramatic backbone. And I wanted ideally a story that people might think that they knew already, right? Like the Mona Lisa is such a global celebrity. She, and I think we often talk about the painting as a she because it's almost like the painting is a living being.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's hard to think that there's something so central to the Mona Lisa that we still don't really know much about today. And, if you ever go to Paris to see the Mona Lisa, the painting is just mobbed by people.
Right.
And so it's hard to believe that someone could, steal the Mona Lisa. Today it feels, certainly impossible. But 100 years ago, the Mona Lisa was, not nearly as famous. To say that the Mona Lisa was famous at all would probably be to overstate it. And so what I wanted to do was tell this story about how the unlikely, sometimes bumbling theft of the Mona Lisa creates kind of a little bit paradoxically, her absence creates her fame.
Mhm.
And so it's this unexpected twist that I think really makes the story compelling.
Your book is listed as one of the best books of the year by Publishers Weekly, School Library Journal, Booklist, Kirkus Reviews, NPR, and more. So, did you have a feeling when crafting your story that it was going to be given so much love from the book world?
No, the short answer is no. Uh, uh, I guess the long answer is also no. As I said before, this was sort of my first kind of, I was first taking I was experimenting and kind of seeing what writing for younger audiences would be like. And, I'd written a book for adults and I'd done a bunch of journalism, but I never tried this sort of thing before and I didn't really know if I would like it. Um, and I think that was in some ways an advantage because I didn't have any sense of sort of what I should do or what I shouldn't do. Um, and that made it a lot of fun. I could just sort of experiment with different things. Um, but it also meant that by the time I was done, I had absolutely no idea if anyone would be interested, right? Um, and so the whole thing has been like a total surprise. Really, I've been shocked kind of every step of the way, and it's been, hugely gratifying to hear that people like you read the book and liked the book.
Yeah. And I think what really sets your books apart is, I think, as I mentioned earlier, just and you mentioned as well, it's just they're so unique. And the uniqueness of your stories, the histories that kind of go untold in history books that you might normally see in a classroom, actually, like as a kid, and even adults for that matter, when they learn about these entirely new theories, these new, these kind of adventures that go untold, it's just automatically kind of compelling. Like, I had no idea this happened. So you just kind of feel that compulsion to dive into these kinds of stories. And, you know, talking about your writing process and how you craft your story specifically, I just really admire how you weave history and intrigue throughout The Mona Lisa Vanishes. The way you explore how people's fascination with conspiracy theories and the attention surrounding the painting's disappearance just ultimately, as you mentioned, helped make the Mona Lisa one of the most famous works of art in history. The twists, turns, and mysteries in your book make it truly captivating. So I'm curious to know, if you had the chance to sit down with one person involved in the Mona Lisa disappearance, who would it be? And what's one question that you'd ask them and why?
Well, I think, this is sort of an unfair response. But, I'm going to go with it anyway. Uh, which is to say that I wouldn't want to meet with any of the detectives. I wouldn't want to meet with the person who stole the Mona Lisa. The person I'd want to meet would be a person who is suspected of having
Mm,
stolen the Mona Lisa, and that is Pablo Picasso. So about a few months into the investigation, the Paris police decide that Pablo Picasso and a good poet friend of his, Apollinaire, are the people who are behind the theft. And they do this not without reason. Picasso is actually connected to someone who stole things from the Louvre, and but they sort of leap on this connection and they drag Picasso before the press. And so I guess I'd love to sit down and talk with Picasso generally about all sorts of things, but as anyone would. Um, but I'd love to know sort of what this experience was like for him. It must have been like completely surreal, um, and uh, and and just sort of see what it was like to have lived through that time, which was a time of the popular press is exploding, so all of a sudden you have all of these newspapers, and you have, really for the first time, the ability to cheaply reproduce images. And so the Mona Lisa is stolen kind of at a moment in which she can really become a celebrity because people can see her face everywhere.
mm.
And so Picasso, when he becomes a suspect, is the new face that is seen everywhere. And so I'd love to know kind of like what that was like for him.
That would be really interesting. Yeah. My next question for you is kind of shifting towards your newest book, which I have right here, A World Without Summer. A volcano erupts, a creature awakens, and the sun goes out. So, for starters, it's quite a title, but it's also quite a book, as the story's main focus is on Tambora. So, let's start with Tambora. Mount Tambora erupted, and newspapers still traveled by horseback. The telegraph wasn't even invented yet. So, how did you go about researching the drastic effects and everything that kind of came with Tambora erupting? Did you use books, primary sources, or other resources? And what was the most fascinating or surprising thing you learned from your research?
Yeah, Tambora, the eruption of Tambora is something that is, it's the most powerful volcanic eruption since the last ice age, so thousands of years.
Mm,
It's weirdly unknown, I think. Um, People who know about an eruption in Indonesia often think of Krakatoa, which was over 50 years later. And one of the reasons Krakatoa is known is exactly what you were saying, Ethan, which is that news was able to be distributed relatively swiftly then. Um, when Tambora erupts, it's an event that destroys huge numbers of lives in the area of Tambora, but outside of it, the news doesn't really escape. And so people who are living through this global climate shock that Tambora creates, the eruption sends all of this ash and all this sulfuric acid up into the sky above the stratosphere, and it sort of creates this sort of cloud over the Earth that changes the climate of the Earth for a few years. And it sort of wreaks havoc. And it has all sorts of, bizarre, sometimes wondrous effects on, the little people down below. And in the couple of hundred years since, tempora has become sort of an object of study, um, in part because it's so unique, and it offers us a little bit of a window into how the climate responds when something sort of dramatic like this happens. And so scientists have studied this. There's also been a lot of people studying kind of like, you know, how people behaved when all of a sudden the things that they thought they could take for granted, the fact that the sun would shine at certain times, rain would come down at other times, when all of those things were taken away, you know, how did society function? And so I just spent a lot of time kind of like reading book after book and journal article after journal article, kind of piecing things together and sort of seeing what things popped out and what were most interesting.
Mm. Yeah, Mount Tambora, its eruption, like you said, wreaked havoc around the world. And scarily enough, with climate change and the repercussions of that, there's a world, our world, where we could see similar effects like we had seen with Tambora, and maybe on a much larger and more long-term scale. So, my next question for you is kind of relating to that point. I appreciate how throughout A World Without Summer, you compare the period following the Tambora eruption to our world today. So, if the climate crisis persists, will the repercussions be similar or worse to Tambora? And could we see more supervolcanoes or mass famine events due to climate change?
I mean, this is the central question, and there are a lot of people working on this question right now,
Mhm.
and there are certainly a lot of um, discouraging and distressing sort of predictions that you can find. Um, I think one of the reasons that I wrote this book is that I think it is partly that I was fascinated just by the narrative. I think it's a tremendously dramatic, exciting, wondrous story, and I wanted to tell that story. But I also wanted to tell a story about climate change that wasn't linked to the present, because I
Mhm.
think sometimes people can shut down for understandable reasons when people start talking about climate change, especially if they're worried about what their lives will be like. Um, and so I wanted to tell a story that was about a global climate crisis, which Tambora is, but it's about something that I think you know is 200 years back in the past, and we can kind of look at and sort of marvel at and investigate, but it doesn't necessarily sort of get our defenses up. We can be sort of open to the story. And I wanted to do that as a way of sort of letting people think about these things without kind of the pressure of the now. And so, you know, I do kind of come back, especially at the end of the book, to kind of touch on how it relates to how we live now and sort of what our own situation is like. But I wanted to give people the freedom to work their way through the book without continually sort of thinking about their current moment. I wanted them to be swallowed up in the story. Um, and hopefully that's how they'll feel. And then they'll come out of it and kind of be able to look around and see the world around them a bit differently.
Mm, that's a great answer. And continuing on with A World Without Summer, as someone who loves nature and is concerned with our Earth's health and climate, World Without Summer really hit home in more ways than one. Through your answer, we can also people watching can discover that your book explores themes of climate change and the far-reaching effects of environmental events. So I'm curious to know if you believe children's books, and even books for adults for that matter, are really needed to help address real-world issues like climate change and environmental crises, and how effective are they in educating the general population?
Sure. I mean, as for the latter question, who knows? Like, I'd like to think that they have an impact, and I'd like to think that a book like this will have an echo.
Mm,
Um, you know, but this is also the only thing I know how to do, so it's natural that I would think that, right? Um, this is the contribution that I know how to make. Um, I do think that books for children and books for adults about these topics certainly have a real role to play in not just in educating people, um, but in kind of making them see the world sort of a bit differently. And I think that's kind of the power of narrative, and that's sort of the power of telling a story. You know, The Mona Lisa Vanishes and A World Without Summer are both examples of, what people call narrative nonfiction. And so if you're sort of trapped in a story and you're absorbed in that story, um, that then can lead you somewhere that you're not necessarily expecting to get to.
mm,
Um, and I think it's harder to do that with just supplying people with facts. You know, you can tell people like, such and such about the oceans and such about the global temperatures and that sort of thing. But I think to really work your way into someone's thinking and into the way they see the world, you really have to kind of do it through the power of narrative. Um, and so I think those books are the books that, you know, might be especially necessary.
absolutely. And speaking of the power of narratives, narratives come in all different forms, whether it be middle grade books, stories for adults, articles from newspapers, or picture books. So, switching gears and talking about the future and your upcoming stories, I discovered you have a new picture book coming out in January 2026. How to Have a Thought, A Walk with Charles Darwin. Great title, and it looks like it's going to be an amazing story. So, can you please share how this book came about and give us some details to look forward to about the story?
Yeah, of course. So this is being published by Neil Porter Books, and it's illustrated by the extraordinary Hadley Hooper, and uh, the work she's done on the book has just been exquisite. Um, it's going to be out in January, and it's the story of Charles Darwin and these walks that he would take around his house in England. And I found out that he would stack these flints or rocks on this path that he would walk on each day. And as he would walk along the path, he would take his walking stick, and every time he made a loop, he would knock off one of the flints. And it was through this walking that Darwin worked out a lot of the ideas that would go on to change the way we understand the world. Um, and I wanted to take that idea of kind of walking your way toward the hard thoughts um, and put it in a picture book because I loved the idea of kind of thinking in motion and the idea that if you're out there in the world and open to the world, that's when kind of curiosity sort of wakes you up, and you begin to find your way toward things that you didn't know were there to find.
Absolutely. And on the topic of picture books, I found out about one of your news stories, or not one of your news stories, but rather one that's new to my heart after discovering it. It's called, I have it right here, Nothing. Obviously, this book is about something, but also the power of nothing. So I did a little digging and I, of course, discovered your story. And it's the meaningful tale about the master pianist David Tudor and his shocking and memorable performance of John Cage's 433. It's a very unique story and one that I'm sure a lot of households will cherish if they don't already, and I excitedly added it to my bookshelf. So, Can you share a bit about the story and how the idea to write nothing came about?
Yeah, so I've been interested in this composition 433 by John Cage for decades now, and it's a so-called silent composition, which is that there's nothing on the page for the pianist to play. It doesn't have to be a piano player. It can be, anyone can perform 433. You can perform it, in the quiet of your own room. And Cage was basically pointing out to people that there's always something behind the nothing. That there's something to listen to and discover. The humming of yourself beneath it all, the things outside that you might not necessarily hear. Um, and it's maybe a little surprising to sort of take this kind of seminal avant-garde composition and turn it into a picture book for kids. But I think Cage's kind of philosophical insight was actually something that children are best positioned to understand, I think. Adults actually tend to be much more resistant to the ideas that Cage was talking about than children. Um, and luckily, Neil Porter saw the same potential in the book, and Chris Roshka, who I was, lucky enough to work with on this, um, did amazing illustrations for it and saw exactly what the book was about. And I'm so lucky that the book exists.
Well, I'm sure a lot of readers are very lucky that it exists as well. It's a very heartwarming, very interesting book, and I think that's you're the master of interesting topics, topics that you don't normally see written about in children's literature. So, I now have time for one final question, a question I ask everybody that I interview. If you could be or meet any literary character, that could be your favorite author or your favorite character in a book, who would it be and why?
Right. So there's too many answers to this question, of course. I think the only way to answer it is to limit yourself to like the last things that you've read, right? Otherwise, I'd be here forever. Uh, I was just um, looking at on my son's bookshelf, looking at an old copy with beautiful illustrations of James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl, and I hadn't thought about that book in a long time. Um, and maybe that would be a good answer because, like, diving your way into a ripe peach and having that peach sail across the ocean with like a motley crew. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good adventure to be on. I think I would. I feel safe giving that as an answer. Um, uh, Also, like if you get hungry, you're well taken care
Mhm.
of. So, so let's go with that, I guess.
It's a great answer. Love that answer, and I've just loved this interview. It's been so much fun. I'm so glad you could come and share your story with us.
Thank you so much, Ethan, for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
It's been a pleasure to have you. And, I don't often get to speak with nonfiction middle grade and picture book writers, so this is really, really special. I love your stories, and I look forward to what you write next. And to everybody tuning in, be sure to check out Nicholas Day's books. I'm serious when I say they will get you or your kids excited about learning. And you won't really feel like you are learning. You'll just feel like you're inside of the story. You're with I guess you could call them characters, but a lot of the people that he discusses are real people in his books. So I guess you're right along there in this historical period, whether it be after the eruption of Mount Tambora or during a rendition of a very famous piano piece. That's all the time we have for today, but everybody, check out Nicholas Day's books. You're not going to regret it. I hope you enjoyed this interview. Stay safe, keep on reading, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye bye.